Morning and welcome to session 1 of the Resiliency Planning webinar series. My name is Dave Rowley and I'm a Michigan State University Extension educator. I will serve as today's moderator. Today's webinar will be the first of 6 sessions brought to you by the MSU Extension's Land Use Team Thought Leader Series in partnership with the MSU School of Planning, Design, and Construction and the National Charrette Institute at MSU. Today's session will discuss the historic context of resiliency planning regarding past epidemics, land use planning lessons, and how emergencies may shape planning communities. Allow me then to introduce today's panel. Professor Eva Cassens-Knorr is an associate professor of urban and regional planning and holds a joint appointment with the MSU Global Urban Studies program. She is also an adjunct associate professor in the MSU Department of Geography, Environment, and Spatial Sciences. Eva received her Diplom Ingenieur in Business Engineering from the German University of Karlsruhe. She also holds a master's degree from the Civil and Engineering Department at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, as well as a doctorate from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning, also from MIT. Her research interests center around resilience, sustainability, and large-scale urban planning projects that are triggered by global forces. Allison Feroli is the Emergency Management Administrator for the City of Grand Rapids. She assumed this position in September 2019 to build the emergency management program for the city. Prior to that, Allison served as the Emergency Management Coordinator for the City of Charlottesville, University of Virginia, and the County Office of Emergency Management. She has a Bachelor's of Arts degree from the University of Laverne and a Master of Public Administration degree from the Virginia Commonwealth University. She also holds a university graduate certificate in Homeland Security and Emergency Preparedness. Timothy Little is the Community Planning Capacity Building Regional Coordinator for Fema Region 5 in Chicago. He holds a degree in urban planning from Ball State University with primary focus on how survivors navigate and negotiate the disaster recovery process in rebuilding their lives in relation to how the community also rebuilds. Tim's work with FEMA Region 5 strives to connect communities with the necessary resources to do recovery on their terms and on their vision. To our audience, as we go through the presentation, if you have questions, please feel free to type those into the Q&A box and we will address those after the presentations. So welcome then to all of our panelists today. And I would ask Eva to begin our program, if you would, please.
Thank you very much. So I'll start off this wonderful seminar and webinar with resiliency planning for, against, and despite pandemics. What does resiliency mean? Resiliency, just like resilient, means a system's ability to bounce back from a serious shock. That means, for one, the system has to withstand the shock in itself. It has to adapt to new circumstances and then recover quickly. By system, we can mean different things. We can mean resilient infrastructures, meaning you're building houses that are prone to withstand earthquakes. You're having a solid economy that's very diverse. It means communities that have a very strong network internally to recover and withstand disasters. Specifically to this pandemic, I also looked up a definition of mental ability to recover quickly from depression, illness, or misfortune that many of us face during pandemics. Community resilience, thus, is the sustained ability of communities to withstand, adapt to, and recover from any type of adversity. So what can we learn actually from pandemics and from our history with them? Previous pandemics in general have provided us with the opportunity to trace the origins and evolution of different viruses, and we've managed to sequence them and reconstruct them. The earliest we trace them back is to the 1918 Spanish flu, which is frequently dubbed the mother of the influenza pandemics. As you might know, its descendants are still evolving and mutating today. So this knowledge on previous pandemics has helped us to prevent some of the spread and plan for future pandemics. So in general, we have seen advances in virology, bacteriology, clinical practice of public health, and vaccinology, among others. If you think about it, back in 1918, we didn't even know the Spanish flu was a virus. So how do we work with what we know? Dubbed as the Spanish flu that it was, yet the name is sometimes misleading. The Spanish flu could have originated in the US, it could have originated in Europe. Up until today, we really don't know where it did. This H1N1 virus spread across the world, and we like to show you here a small example of its spatial and temporal spread in Southeast Asia, where a co-author of mine, Siddharth Chandra, he's the lead author, and I try to show you how this virus spread during that time.
The influenza of 1918 entered India through the port of Bombay on the west coast of India. It is believed to have arrived on ships carrying troops back to India from the First World War in Europe. Shortly thereafter, it flared up in Madras on the southeastern coast of India. The western and southern regions of India together fell victim to the first wave of the epidemic. At this time, the disease also peaked in a small pocket on the eastern coast of India, including the important pilgrimage site of Puri on the Bay of Bengal. This phenomenon appears to have escaped the notice of scholars of the subject. From Bombay and Madras, the influenza spread north to the central provinces and Punjab. The second wave of the epidemic covered the western and central regions of India, with flare-ups in the northeastern province of Assam. The influenza epidemic then progressed to the east, affecting the United Provinces, Bihar, and Bengal. These regions comprise the third peak of the disease. The remote regions of the United Provinces to the north of the Ganges River were among the last to be affected. The last district in which influenza peaked was Bahraich, on the border of India with Nepal.
So as you can see, when you look at the spread of the Spanish flu in British India alone, it evolved similar to COVID. We have seen that it peaked in the fall and the winter. It had two very distinct waves. And it also is known now that the survival of the most infectious strains really drove the pandemic. Same as with COVID-19, primarily the new mutations entered through main cities' port of entries that back then were ships and ports. Learning from our history, looking at the Spanish flu, we've started sequencing and going back in time to try and understand how the H1N1 flu mutated through genetic reassortment. And through these technical advancements, we've now much better understanding. If you think about it, only in 1995 were we able to sequence the viral genome. Today, influenza was and still is a large public health concern in terms of its large scale and seasonality. We've therefore really be able to collect information on various categories that has helped us now to understand how COVID-19 spreads, how it adapts, how it's infecting others, and its pathology. So although many people are still exposed to some type of influenza today, comparatively few pandemics have actually emerged over the past millennium. These disease outbreaks have, however, also occurred in our history in the United States. If you think about back then in the 15th century, we had outbreaks of the plague. Milan tackled this outbreak through a lazzaretto vecchio, where the city basically established an island for quarantine, just like New York City did in the 19th and 20th century, when it quarantined travelers due to the spread of cholera on Swinburne and Hoffman Islands. So during the 20th century alone, we've seen in the United Nations record over 30-fold increases in different types of biological disasters, primarily epidemics. So for now, our communities have responded to these pandemics primarily in two ways. The long-term strategy, which we've only been able to have now, is vaccines, and short-term, it was always social distancing and primarily quarantines. When we socially distance and use those like quarantines, we've seen secondary and tertiary effects on our communities. Though the authority to quarantine is technically a public health measure and police power, these public health measures vary greatly even among communities and from locality, from country to country. We've seen, particularly in this pandemic, the decision to socially distance, and I caution for the word socially distance because it's really physical distancing. But if it's applied inappropriately, it can cause great harm to individuals and our society at large. Communities also have responded to disease outbreaks to prevent them long term. For example, in New York City, the Metropolitan Board of Health was established, new zoning codes were developed so that the city wouldn't be overcrowded, and further sanitary conditions were implemented to prevent cholera. So in essence, every time we've seen a disease, we've tried to increase open spaces, have introduced spatial barriers, sometimes short-term, we've improved sanitary conditions, sometimes we've even relocated populations to safe spaces, and we've imposed travel restrictions. In doing so, technology has greatly helped us. So if we look back at the history of SARS, MERS, bird flus, they've prompted a series of studies. So the Spanish flu, for example, was driven by the steam locomotives which were implemented during that time. SARS was really looked for in patients through thermal and video surveillance. MERS, we started using Web 2.0 to spread the information about the syndrome faster. And now if we see with COVID-19, there's many other Web 2.0 solutions, as well as mobility solutions and technology solutions that help us continue working from home and help us keep communities safe. Technology thus has been widely used to help us communities to changing circumstances and share that information globally. Back in 2017, the Time already warned us that we've known for a long time that several viral strains and their mutations can potentially result in the next pandemic. But some of us have argued we weren't really prepared for it, especially as globalization has increased with such speed that has enabled really farther spread and speedier spread than before of pathogens, especially now that we have air travel compared to the 1918 Spanish flu. And on the other hand, we also have now international cooperation that might help us find faster solutions if we share results. So the global health systems have really constantly evolved with new pandemics and trying to combat them by evaluating what has worked and what hasn't worked in the past. So and then came the next pandemic, COVID-19, which was declared on 11th of March in 2020, a global health pandemic. Since then, there were different measures implemented in communities that ranged from self-quarantining, which is primarily voluntary, to travel constraints, location closures, like restaurants, shopping areas. We've seen cap on gatherings, even going down to 0, which is shelter in place and complete house arrest. So these communities, or our communities across the world, have implemented these varying policies to keep their population safe and slow the spread of the disease. What we've seen, however, in community resilience, that technology has helped us to socially distance, to physically distance, but we've also seen the great divide when you look at who has the economic means to own the technology, who has the time and support to implement them correctly, who has the education to handle new technologies, who is able to afford reliable wireless access, or who has the ability to provide computer, smartphone, and tablets to their children to learn. So the main takeaway for me for the pandemic has painfully brought to light that in our communities, there is an existing technological divide and a very great difference in accessing these technologies to help us manage the pandemic. We've also seen a lot of transportation changes due to the prolonged social distancing. In general, we've seen a large decrease in any type of public transit, a decrease in shared mobility usage. But on the other hand, we've seen an uptake in biking and walking, which is certainly very beneficial for communities. And we've also, unfortunately, seen the rise again in private car to isolate ourselves. In the future, my best guess is that air travel will likely be transformed permanently so that mask wearing becomes or might become standard, temperature checks might become standard, and there might be a possibility for quarantines, especially in international travel arrangements. So when we look at our communities and land uses, which temporary spaces could become permanent, If we think about the dedicated outdoor dining we saw in the summers, or closures of street to allow for more active transportation and follow the demand of people commuting, you might see more public spaces and access to nature and a broader expansion of 5G networks across our communities. So as we're consistently transforming, we see these physical barriers arise, but we're trying to really achieve social closeness among us. So to summarize, and maybe a little bit for discussion, that every pandemic is essentially unique, but the pandemic impacts in themselves depend on how well communities are prepared locally, how fast the pandemic and virus strain can be detected, and how immediate this response can be. So to prevent the global spread in the future, information must be immediate and it must be accurate. As we're learning through mutations dubbed as the British one or South African one, we have to learn quickly and learn from what we've gone through over the past year. The short-term strategies are likely to remain the same, so that we have to implement physical distancing measures, we have to implement quarantines, and we have to trace contact very quickly. What will stand out is the permanent transformations we might see in urban spaces, such as more urban spaces that are public, more nature, access to nature. We might see a relocation to rural regions that are permanent. And so my main argument is, and I hope we can learn from as this pandemic unfolds, we really have to learn the lessons to plan the resiliency for the next one that might arise. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, Eva, for that presentation. And our next panelist, Allison, if you would provide us with your remarks, if you would, please.
Yes, thank you, David. All right, good morning, everybody. So I want to, so moving in from what Eva was talking about, I think that we all know that the global pandemic has truly impacted the whole world and really has had a major impact on our resiliency and future planning of our communities. The one thing I want to make sure that we spend some time on and making sure that we don't forget about the other hazards that have impacted not only in the last year, but just in our history. And I think there's some complexities that we're going to start seeing in regards to how we're handling our responsive recovery and even mitigation for future hazards. So here on the slide, you'll see that just in the last year, there's been not only the global pandemic that has impacted the state of Michigan, but we've also had a multitude of other emergencies and disasters and hazards that have impacted the state that have really been, with the pandemic going on top of that, has truly made our response and recovery pretty complex. And I think that's going to be, and I'll talk a little bit more about this here in a little bit, about how just the back-to-back type of disasters that are going to be occurring as we move forward is really going to have a major impact on our ability to properly plan and really stay resilient. So just as a reminder, we outside of the pandemic, there was civil unrest that occurred in multiple communities in the state of Michigan and also across the whole United States last summer. Which really, in conjunction with the pandemic, was a complex issue, and there's some concern on how that either impacted the spread of the pandemic and other things like that, and then also really drove another focus and complexity in regards to planning and response needs in communities. Outside of the civil unrest, there was also a major dam failure up in the Midland area here in Michigan last summer. And so 2 dams broke in the Midland area. And really that, I think, is another piece when it comes to resiliency, and then also just planning in our communities, and the need for proper planning was how we need to augment and maintain our infrastructure. There's a whole task force that's been developed at the state level to really focus on the needs, how we can improve our dam system across the state. And then also there's been a lot of focus and talk about trying to invest in our infrastructure in general. But one thing that's quite interesting when it comes to just the immediate planning needs for our communities, and I think the resiliency with this major disaster that happened in the Midland area was because of the pandemic. It made thousands of people were evacuated, and the whole community was pretty much destroyed. So really thinking about how do you evacuate and shelter community members in the middle of a pandemic properly. Our typical planning efforts when it comes to sheltering is in congregate settings, which is not ideal during a global pandemic. So really through this complex planning need, when it came to trying to properly evacuate and shelter community members from that, from the dam failures that happened. Also, flooding is a typical occurrence here in the state of Michigan. One thing that moving into the early spring of 2020, as we were really ramping up the response and of the pandemic, was at that time, all rivers and the water table and even the Great Lakes were so full to the point where if we got any major rainfall or if we had a major snowstorm with quick snow melt, it was going to cause a lot of issues in regards to flooding in our communities. And again, going back to the same issues that the Midland area found with the dam failure is really how does that, there's some major impacts with that. There's no place for that water to go. And then also, again, you are coupling a whole nother potential disaster on top of a major impactful disaster of that pandemic. And then let's not forget that in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of talk and a lot of concern and monitoring of another public health issue, which is the EEE virus, the Eastern Equine Encephalitis, that was definitely found on the west side of Michigan in 2019 and also in 2020. Thankfully, this virus in 2020 was not as prominent as it was in 2019. But again, looking at a whole nother public health issue that is concerning due to climate change and just the change in how natural disasters are having on our communities. One thing with this, it has a 33% fatality rate in humans, so it's high in the mortality rate with that. So it's very important for us to monitor these additional viruses and potential issues when it comes to insects and other known viruses that can transmit from animals or insects into humans. I mean, that's another thing with ticks, tick-borne illnesses and things like that that we may see that may impact our planning and future needs when it comes to our communities. And then last on here is obviously we don't want to forget the shoreline erosion that occurred in 2020. It was a pretty big deal in regards to, again, going back to that increased levels of water in our Great Lakes, the rivers, and just the water table in general. And thinking about just as that impacts the shoreline, which is a pretty, it's an area that a lot of tourism happens in the summertime. There's a lot of vacation homes that occur there. So these communities really rely on that area for the tourism that occurs during the summertime. And so you're also seeing with the erosion of that, the impacts of these, not only the homes that are there and folks that live there, but also how it's impacting the natural shoreline of the Great Lakes, and then may impact just with our tourism and our ability to pull from the economic positivity of that. So again, going back, and it's not just our resiliency in regards to us as individuals, but also connecting this to how it has an economic impact, and really looking forward into our future and how we're seeing the current things in our history, but also looking forward to how this is going to impact our future. I think also this is another great point for us as we see a complex impact for multiple incidents occurring on top of each other. It's really important as planners and emergency managers and local leaders is to continue to build partnerships and share our knowledge and our information to be able to properly work together to build the resiliency through our future planning with our communities, so that we are incorporating all of these potential impacts of just the complex issues that are occurring from these disasters. Here I have a graph that a fellow emergency manager in California created on just kind of showing the disaster cycle and how the pandemic and just the constant emergencies and disasters that occurred in 2020 really impacted the disaster cycle. So if you are not familiar with the disaster cycle, it's a circular approach where you have preparedness, response, recovery, and then mitigation. And so here, if you notice, just with all the things that were occurring in 2020, we were constantly in this response and recovery mode throughout the whole year of 2020, and not ever really able to get back into that cycle of getting to move back into the mitigation and preparedness phase, where we can then take time to do proper planning, mitigating future hazards and impacts of those hazards. And just so it's just this constant, again, I guess I would say action mode of just go, 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 go. And I think if we continue to see years like we saw in 2020, this will have a major impact on not only of our ability to properly do long-term planning for our communities, but also the impact of our personnel that are doing that planning, between emergency managers, obviously our healthcare workers due to the pandemic, our first responders, and everybody that really has a hand in this typical cycle of being able to work on that resiliency and the preparedness, and then just so that we can properly respond and recover from these incidents. COVID really impacted a lot of things, but I think one thing too we can't forget is it definitely forced our communities to be resilient, and to kind of step back and really see the importance of the simplicity of what's necessary in our life. But also, as we just hit the year mark about a week ago with how COVID's impacted the state of Michigan. People are exhausted, communities are exhausted. And I think, and again, just seeing how that exhaustion is really going to have a play in the ability to continue the resiliency and building through mitigation and preparedness measures to properly plan through the future. I think also here, again, this is another important piece of why it is important for communities of all sizes and community members, all the way from the bottom up to our top leaders, it's important for us to remind ourselves of the hazards that can impact our community, and then also looking at how things are changing so that we can look long-term and properly plan, and also ensure folks have the proper mitigation measures through insurances and other needs to stay resilient and to continue to be able to recover from these impacts. It's going to be a complex future. This is, I think 2020 definitely showed this with, again, like I mentioned, with the pandemic, and then on continuous hits with other emergencies and disasters all across the world, really, on top of as we're dealing with this global pandemic. And here on the right side, you'll see this is a normal disaster cycle that usually happens, and kind of how do we adjust to this cycle and be able to ensure that we are doing the mitigation and preparedness efforts to build up our communities. We will start seeing multiple emergencies and disasters occurring at the same time or back to back. And that's going to have a massive impact on how we plan and can we plan fast enough in our future planning through our master plans and our hazard mitigation plans, and being able to really look at our history, but look at our current day-to-day of what's happening, and then also kind of combine those two and see how moving forward, things are going to become even more complex, and what is that going to do? Climate change is a huge piece and needs to be thought of and continuously planned for, especially in our hazard mitigation plans and our master plans for our communities. Just looking at, as an example, Down just a few weeks ago, the state of Texas was hit with a massive winter storm. They've had a winter storm hit them before, but that didn't last as long as this recent one did, to where they're now seeing how homes that are built and how insulation is in homes and in facilities down in Texas is not built to have long-term cold temperatures like that. And they're not used to using materials that we're used to using here in Michigan to build the communities to be able to withstand that type of weather. And so really looking at how things are changing like that, and even how that may happen here in Michigan, to where we might start seeing an increase in heat and long-term heat waves here in the summer times. And what does that do to our current infrastructure? Do we have homes that have central air conditioning to where we are able to properly cool our facilities in our homes? And what does that look like? Also, prolonged urban flooding is something to think about, and how that may change. And we're so used to hearing, well, I don't live in a flood zone, so I don't need to have flood insurance on my home because my home's never going to flood. And now we're seeing with climate change that that's not true anymore. It doesn't matter if you live in a flood zone or if you don't live in a flood zone, there's always a risk and always a potential for every parts of our community to flood. And really, again, looking at how we need to plan for that and educate our community to become resilient through having the proper flood insurance for your home, and why that's so important. And I think one thing here is that there's this misnomer of just reliance on government when we have major disasters. That we have a major flood, I don't have flood insurance, it's okay, FEMA's gonna come into town and we're going to rebuild, I'm gonna get all my money back to rebuild my home. And that's just not the case. And trying to again, really understand the realities of the resources we have through our federal, state, and local governments, but also what private sector resources are out there so that we can ensure that our communities have those correct resources to build back and to be able to get back on their feet after a major disaster. There's a lot of economic impact that we are seeing from the current pandemic and the constant disasters that are occurring back to back. And what is that going to look like, and how is that going to impact our future and just how our communities are built? Like Ava talked about, and how we are adjusting just some of our planning efforts, and how there's been a lot of push right now with restaurants having social zones and more outdoor seating and outdoor gatherings, and so using that piece, and then also really thinking about how do we take the impacts of the pandemics and our other hazards and combine those, and how do they impact how we plan our communities and adjust so that we don't have reoccurring economic impacts on our communities. Another thing here that I think has become very come to the forefront because of the pandemic is the importance of continuity planning. And this again goes back into that economic resiliency for our communities and planning, is that we need to focus on developing continuity of operations plans at a micro and macro level for our government organizations, for our local businesses, and also as individuals and families. And how are we going to continue our operations and continue what we are doing to be present and to live a resilient lifestyle in response to some of these disasters. Unfortunately, there's a lot of concern with no ability to have long-term planning. I think that there's a great example currently happening, and also what we saw after 9/11, is that after these major disasters and major impacts from these disasters, we start seeing a massive influx of funding streams that come out. Right after 9/11, there was billions of dollars that came out to localities and states to use to help because of 9/11, but there was also a very short turnaround of when those funding streams had to be spent. So there's not an ability to really properly use those funds to do some long-term impactful planning, so we're using those funding streams appropriately. And again, that's kind of happening right now, again, due to from COVID. There's the CARES Act funding that came out last year. There was a deadline to spend most of that by the end of 2020. We have some new funding coming out that has specific deadlines on this to spend this money. And again, that goes into ensuring that communities have proper plans, so that through our hazard mitigation plans is really a key one, and other recovery frameworks and plans, so that we can then, as these funding streams come out because of major disasters, we have a plan in place and kind of an understanding of how we can potentially utilize these funding streams appropriately. There's also a lot of inequity in how funding and ability to be resilient and bounce back is occurring. And how does that impact our communities? And again, building back our communities after major disasters. Because it's not necessarily always consistent across the board when it comes to sizes of communities, and really looking at how does that impact our ability to plan for the future. So I just want to wrap up here a little bit, kind of going with all this in mind and looking at, as the emergency manager from the city of Grand Rapids, and kind of talk a little bit about what the city has done to kind of look at our history, what's happening now, and looking forward to become more resilient. One thing, because of there was a major flood in 2013 that truly impacted the downtown area of Grand Rapids from the flood from the Grand River. And because of that, they then built a flood wall along the Grand River in the downtown area to help mitigate the impacts of future flooding from that river. And in 2018, there was a major flood that occurred again, and it was proven through that flood wall and mitigation effort that we did not have any major impacts from that flood. So again, showing that these mitigation efforts and proper planning and learning from our history is able to put in these mitigation efforts in place to make our community more resilient. So now our downtown area, as by that investment, is more protected and more resilient in when it comes to if we have a major increase in water coming through the Grand River. Additionally, it was from the flooding, and then there was a few other natural events that occurred, and just the growth in population here in the city of Grand Rapids over the years. It was identified that the city needed to have their own emergency management program, and to focus on the needs of the city. And originally they were very connected to the Kent County Emergency Management Office, but wanted to really be able to have their own emergency management program so we can focus on the needs and to grow in the resiliency of this community as the city of Grand Rapids grows. So with that, they decided to hire an emergency manager, which I came on board in September 2019 to do that, to help build an emergency management program so that we can do the work in place to do that long-term planning and future resiliency planning to build this community into a more resilient community. And then also currently right now, one thing that we are doing, the city does have a hazard mitigation plan that's in coordination with Kent County and Ottawa County. And our plan expires in June of 2022. So myself and the emergency managers from Kent and Ottawa County are working together right now to update that hazard mitigation plan, and making sure that we're doing exactly what we've been talking about today, looking at our history, our current situation, and in our future, to work on this updated plan to identify how hazards have been impacting us, and then identifying strategies that we want to focus on in the next 5 years to ensure that our community stays resilient. And then also that provides us the ability to have some strategies to pull on when there is hazard mitigation funding to build, to implement mitigation and resiliency efforts in the community. And so I do again want to thank you for that time for this. I'm going to turn it over to Timothy to move on.
All right. And thank you, Allison. And exactly, Tim, could we have your remarks, if you would, please?
Yes, sir. Good morning, everyone. Let me make sure I get this set up here. Let's see here. Share screen. I want to share this. Share. All right. Can everyone see that? Let me make sure I'm not crazy.
Yep.
All right. Perfect. Perfect. Well, good morning. My name's Timothy Little. I am the Region 5 Community Planning Capacity Building Regional Coordinator. Really long title. It's okay. We just call me the CPCB guy. So, so I'm with Fema, and this is our motto. Our new motto, as of a few years ago, we kind of went through several things that I'll talk about, and it became helping people before, during, and after disasters, and that's what we believe in. Now, I know that y'all mentioned, and this whole webinar series is about resilience, and so I want to talk about resilience in relationship to some of the historicalness of the FEMA, and how we have slowly brought resilience into what we do. I shouldn't say slowly. We have been bringing it in. It's there. Trust me. I promise. So there's a quote from our former Chief of Staff, Eric Heiberger. He says, "Resiliency is the backbone of emergency management and the foundation of the FEMA mission." And I truly believe that. But when Allison mentioned earlier, she talked about something that I imagine many of you are familiar with. She mentioned the 4 phases of emergency management: mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery. And I know when you look at that, you're like, Tim, I don't see the word resilience in there. And I believe me, I've looked. I got out the magnifying glass myself. I didn't see it, but actually, it's everywhere. There's resilience in every part of the disaster, the emergency management cycle. We have resiliency. It is truly the backbone of all that we do. And I'm going to show you through some of the history of FEMA and some of the history of disasters how that has kind of come to be. All righty. So FEMA didn't get its start right away. When the United States was created, it went FEMA, the Department of War, Department of State. No, it didn't go like that at all. FEMA is a pretty young organization in the federal government. And the reason for that is we've just had to continue to learn. And as the United States has grown, and as government has grown, and as disasters have continued to become more and more dangerous and large and just monstrous. I mean, you think about 2017, especially if you live in the southeast or the southern part of the United States, like we're talking about hurricane after hurricane after hurricane after hurricane. Or if you lived in Florida in 2004, there's 4 hurricanes that hit Florida in 2004. And even last year, we had 4 storms hit Louisiana. So a lot of the number of disasters is continuing to grow and grow and grow. And to kind of demonstrate that, we'll get to Michigan in just a second here. But most people don't know that the first thing that actually happened when it comes to disasters in the United States was the Portsmouth fire in New Hampshire, and Congress actually passed a bill suspending bond payments owed by the city's merchants. And actually, that kind of became the standard for the following years up till 1979. Is that Congress itself would pass bills to help communities and states after each individual disaster. And up to that time, there was 128 separate bills were passed by Congress for different disasters. Disasters such as Hurricane Betsy or the Chicago Fire of 1871. And so each time Congress would have to go through and go through a process and negotiate, providing assistance to survivors and their communities. And that's a really cumbersome process. And so kind of what happened, some of the foundations for FEMA were laid, particularly after World War II, with a civil defense. And a lot of that, it became more of a continuity of government. And if you're familiar, FEMA, there's like FEMA bunkers. There's a few of them. And they're kind of a carryover from civil defense, where we had folks underground, and in case of a nuclear disaster or something of like that, folks would, leadership, the nation's leaders would be able to kind of, be safe and help run the country as we rebuilt. And so, but to get there and to move towards, this new like push for resilience and this new realization that there is more to disasters than just preparing for them, mitigating them, responding and recovery. Like, how do we bring everything together? And so, FEMA kind of was formed after, honestly, truly after the 3 Mile Island incident. Um, and it was quite an interesting situation in that there were over, oh, I went too far. There were over 100 different entities responding to the 3 Mile Island incident. And it kind of made for kind of an organizational mess, if you can imagine, 100 different agencies jockeying for, lead, or jockeying for, who has the most money or who has money, or, kind of just, it was a mess, I'll be honest. And so in 1979, on April 1st, President Jimmy Carter signed in creation through executive order. Let me see, the executive order 12127, and that established FEMA, and then actually allowed for it to help reorganize a lot of those entities that were in several, different branches of the federal government, and bring those together under one umbrella. And that really kind of started us moving towards like a cohesive response and recovery and mitigating and preparing for disasters, and ultimately for becoming a more resilient nation. Um, Now, like I said, the Congress would have to pass a bill every time that there was a disaster. And so the bill that now kind of defines disaster work, instead of one for each disaster, we have the Stafford Act, which came about in 1988. And that kind of set the precedent for the Disaster Relief Fund and how FEMA would be funded, and how those funds would then be, dispersed to the states, and how that money would then could be used for communities to recover from. And the thing, though, is that after every major disasters, we at FEMA, we have continued to evolve and learn from those disasters, and we want to be better. We want to provide assistance better. We want to help y'all recover better. And so a couple of things happened. The big one being the 9/11 happened, and that created DHS, the Department of Homeland Security, and FEMA was absorbed into that. Another big thing that happened was Hurricane Katrina, and that led to the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act, which kind of helped change how FEMA would go about doing its work and providing assistance to survivors. Um, it helped us to reorganize our shortfalls and empower us to, help y'all build capacity and improve capabilities. Um, and even continuing on from 2005 with Katrina, the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act, in response to Hurricane Sandy, kind of changed the way the federal government works with tribes and tribal partners, and to provide them more direct assistance. And still, even after 2017, the Disaster Recovery Reform Act was created to help FEMA provide more assistance to the states, and communities affected by disaster. And so, I mean, that's a quick timeline, and we could probably talk about this for several hours, because it's fun, right? It's fun to talk about timelines. No, I get it. I get it. It's early in the morning. Let's move on. So, since 1953, Michigan has had 42 federally declared disasters, and this is just a little map here of FEMA Region 5, and showing some of the areas, the density of the numbers of disasters per county. And you can see that Michigan, some parts of Michigan are kind of, lighter than others, but, every county in FEMA Region 5, every county in Michigan has been affected by disaster. And that's not even including COVID, which is a nationwide disaster. So between 2005 and 2019, you can kind of see some of those numbers, how much money FEMA has given out in grants here in Region 5. It's just, I mean, some of these numbers are just incomprehensible, billions and billions of dollars. So, so I wanted to talk about the history and kind of where we were to kind of talk about where we're going. And because you see, disasters, I love this quote. It's from former FEMA administrator James Lewitt, who was in charge of FEMA kind of after Hurricane Andrew and in Clinton, in the Clinton administrations, during the Clinton administration, sorry. Disasters have a way of making us stronger in the broken places. And I think FEMA also learns from that too, in that we have consistently changed and evolved as disasters have continued to happen and will continue to happen with increased frequency. And so we want to be a better agency to provide assistance to our communities, our states, to help you all come back better, stronger. So, but I know what you're thinking. What does that look like? I mean, we've been talking about timelines, we've been talking about, money, but what does that truly look like? And so after the Disaster Recovery Reform Act in 2018, FEMA kind of set about wanting to change a few things. And so we came up with our strategic plan. We want to helping people together. And we had three major goals in that one strategic plan. And at the end, I'm going to talk about two programs specifically that I think can be of great assistance to communities in Michigan. And so our strategic plan came out in 2018, kind of right after the disasters in 2017, hurricanes Maria, Irma, and Harvey. And it kind of helped us reframe some of the way we want to help y'all and some of the programs that we want to provide to the states and their communities. So I'm going to just dig in a little bit to this. And so we have three main goals: build a culture of preparedness, ready the nation for catastrophic disasters, and reduce the complexity of FEMA. So in my previous life, I worked in local government. Well, I worked for a regional planning commission, and worked alongside a lot of folks in local government. And so, I completely understand being from the outside and looking in and being like, huh? Like, there is a lot of complexity, and, to FEMA, there's a lot of, just regulations and rules and auditing and all that kind of stuff. There's a lot to it, and I won't kid you, but FEMA does want to make it simpler, and we do want to prepare our nation for disasters in the future. Continue to do that, and so going back to the cycle of phases of this emergency management, respond, mitigate, recover, and oh no, prepare. And going back to that, resilience is part of that, and in readying the nation and building a culture of preparedness, that is resilience. And so I'm just kind of quickly walk through these. We want to build a culture of preparedness within our communities and our governments that will support a national effort to be ready for the worst disasters at all levels, at the individual, family, community, state, local, tribal, territorial, and the federal government level. And so, moving on to, I made a mistake. We want to prepare the nation for more and more catastrophic disasters. We recognize that disasters are continuing to happen with more and more frequency, and I've said that several times over. But I mean, just think back in your own lives, of how much of disasters you've heard just on the news, and then you factor in COVID-19, And I mean, golly, it's kind of what Allison showed with that timeline graph, where just y'all have been, fatigue is a real thing, and we've been in this for over a year now, and it's crazy. And the likelihood is it's going to happen again. It's insane. Lastly, we want to simplify FEMA. In reducing the complexity of FEMA, we want to provide that streamlined survivor and grantee experiences, and provide straightforward processes and policies for staff. It will decrease administrative burdens, improve stewardship of federal taxpayer dollars, and allow for a more efficient and effective execution of our mission. Kind of like what I said, resiliency is the backbone of what we do. It's the foundation of everything. And those three goals, I think there are two programs that can really kind of help continue to build resilience in Michigan and in your communities. And I'm sure many of you are very aware of them, or at least one of them. The Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, been around a long time. And then our new program called BRIC, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. It's the new pre-disaster mitigation grant program. And so I just want to quickly walk through these two. HMGP program becomes available after a federally declared disaster. It wants to be cost effective, it wants to reduce and eliminate risk and damage from future natural hazards. It requires that improvements done, meet or up to date with the latest international building codes, that aligns with the applicable hazard mitigation plan, which we'll get to here in just a second, and it meets all environmental and historic preservation requirements. And so as of the end of 2020, this came out in November. This is a hazard mitigation plan status for Michigan. And if you can kind of see, there's a lot of counties in red, and those are counties with expired hazard mitigation plans. And counties in green are currently approved. And the reason I bring this up is it's really important to have a hazard mitigation plan that is up to date with new ideas, new plans, new research in it. The update isn't too terrible, but you want to keep that updated, because if funding does become available, then you can then execute those plans. And currently, right now, money is available. There are about 50 counties that have expired mitigation plans, but because of the disaster last year in Gladwin, Midland, Saginaw, oh boy, I'm going to get this wrong, Osceola, in those counties, because of the disaster there, it actually opened up hazard mitigation funds for the whole state. And so there's money on the table, y'all, and it'll continue to, it's on the table for about a year from the disaster. And so, please reach out to FEMA, please reach out to your state hazard mitigation officer, and talk with them. Please reach out to us. You can reach out to me too, please, and talk with us about, opportunities for a hazard mitigation grant program in Michigan. Now, going back to the three goals, I bring these back because I think these goals really kind of demonstrate our desire, FEMA's desire for resiliency. And in that, we have a new program called BRIC, and that's Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. And it kind of streamlines the process. It gives a lot of flexibility. It builds capacity and adds technical know-how to the work that's going on. And it sets very clear priorities. BRIC is for big ideas, and it's got, it's prioritized with lifeline and infrastructure projects. It wants to be innovative. It wants to, provide some technical assistance and help build the capacity and the capability of local communities and counties. It's a streamlined version that's also simplified, You know, that's one of FEMA's new goals, is to be simplified and simplify the whole process and experience for survivors and their communities. And part of that is done with our FEMA grants outcome, FEMA Go. That's our new program. It's got better extensions, and additionally, it allows for projects that are phased. So, you know, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. And so, you know, moving forward, please take a look at BRIC. It aims to categorically shift the federal focus away from reactive disaster spending and toward research-supported proactive investment in community resilience. It will enable large and innovative infrastructure projects, advanced technical capability, and more partnerships with state, local, territorial, and tribal, and NGO and community-based organizational partners. We could spend the rest of the day talking about BRIC. We really could. FEMA over the summer came out with about 5 or 6 hours worth of videos on BRIC, kind of walking through all the different processes and all the different new opportunities that BRIC is creating. And you can check those out at fema.gov/BRIC. There's plenty of time to apply. The notice for federal opportunity came out in September. And so please, you know, check out BRIC. And I think honestly, BRIC's a great way to help create a more resilient Michigan, regardless of, you know, pandemic or disaster. You know, like, it's a really great program, and I beg you to please check it out. So that's all for I have. I'm going to stop sharing here and give it back over to David. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much. And we would like to say thank you for today's partners. And there's a list of those, and we thank all for the contributions and participation that we have seen. And we can move into, let's see, get started on the questions here. And as it says there, please, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A feature, and we'll try and address those, as many of those as possible in the time that we have left. So here, let me see if I can get to the proper space. Here we go. All right, our panelists are set. We have a few questions that have come in, and so let's just kind of take these one at a time. First question, and let's see, I think this is probably addressed to everyone. Has there been research on the effectiveness of some of the modifications to the built environment that were implemented in prior pandemics? Such as did spreading development out of the concentrated urban areas really help? And this individual is interested in potential ramifications of COVID on movements to stop sprawl and increase density, public versus private transportation, housing, and so on. Did everybody get that, or you want me to go through that again? That's an interesting question.
Sure, I can take that one.
All right, please.
So we've also written a paper, which I didn't present, on estimating a density threshold of populations in terms of how during the Spanish flu pandemic, and at which point communities were more protected or less protected. And it was really with 319 people per community that the spread was significantly less. So yes, back then there was a density threshold for the Spanish flu that dictated if you spread out communities, you will see lesser infections. So now, but going on to this one, we have to think about it in a different way, right? We had the sanitary conditions stopped cholera, but COVID could be more seen like a flu. It spreads similarly. So we've, as a society, accepted that the flu exists and there is a vaccine for it. Some take it, some don't take it. We might get herd immunity, but it's an accepted risk. In terms of spreading through, the spreading essentially occurs through gathering of people. So you see more opportunities in cities per se, right? It has higher densities. It has more spaces where people can gather, concerts, festivals. So more modifications you've seen towards it is, for example, in grocery stores where they put lighting at the top of the ceiling in the hopes of killing the virus, or HVAC units. So there's some smaller things cities already have done and will continue to implement. But in terms of preventing sprawl, I really don't know whether we can do that in a way that it's safe for everyone.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. Another question, what prevents localities and counties to learn from actions such as mask wearing to prevent or reduce transmission of sickness? For example, 50 to 80% of train passengers masked up when traveling in Japan over 60 years ago. Why did the United States not pick up on this practice?
I could take that again.
Okay.
I think these
Thank
first
you.
two, they came in when I was presenting, so I feel responsible.
All right.
So I think we learned, we just simply didn't apply, right? We knew that the spread occurs through interactions, through gatherings, and some institutions mandated mask wearing, some didn't. And I think just within the United States, we didn't have that history that Japan had. If you think about where SARS occurred, where MERS occurred, it was in these regions where you had a more recent history on how to wear the mask and how to prevent it. And then you have, for example, the acceptance of the flu, you have the vaccines, and especially in the US, you also have a different sense of freedom. It's not as highly densely populated as Tokyo, for example. And so, yeah, I think trains in general can be safer as concerts. And in the cities and in the US, you have more types of interactions and more accepted social gatherings in wider scales.
All right. Well, thank you very much. The next question addresses FEMA. So Tim, this is probably yours. Does FEMA provide enhanced planning grants for communities in Michigan? And if yes, how can communities apply? And if not, why not?
Well, okay, so I had to double check that one.
Mhm.
So currently, at least as the way I understand it, Michigan is not a state with an enhanced mitigation plan, which would prevent it from being able to apply, or prevent communities from being able to apply for those kinds of grants for communities, and that I mean, that's kind of a relationship between the state and FEMA that has to be worked out with the state hazard mitigation plan, and so right now, just as of the end of last year, yeah, Michigan is not on that list. But it doesn't mean Michigan can't be on that list if that's what you're referring to. To receive approval of an enhanced plan, a state must show that it has developed a comprehensive mitigation program and is capable of managing increased funding for its mitigation goals. I mean, it's kind of that's the statement. That's literally from FEMA, like their statement. So at this time, I would say Michigan is not in that enhanced planning part, but it could be in the future.
All right. Looks like there's kind of like a follow-up for Tim on this one. How do you build a culture of preparedness?
Oh, Dr. Lamore, that's a good question. Okay, so in FEMA, how we're doing that is we are encouraging that to start with the individual and start with their family. And so internally we're doing that. We have had several amounts of training on, how to prepare our own family's disaster plan. how to prepare a go bag, how to have supply. We need to have those kinds of supplies ourselves so we can take care of ourselves so that, when disaster strikes, we can also help take care of um, the whole nation. Additionally, there's been a lot of discussion in FEMA talking about social vulnerability and social capital. Last year-ish, we had an expert on social capital come and talk about the relationships that help people come back from disaster. And, I think part of building that culture of preparedness is recognizing that, the first responders, your family, your friends, your neighbors, your local community groups, your religious organizations, those oftentimes are the people that are going to provide the greatest impact to survivors personally. And so, leaning into those kinds of relationships and fostering those kinds of relationships, I think is an ongoing process that we're trying to encourage. But, again, we're the federal government. We can't tell you what to do. But I would definitely encourage Daniel Aldrich, who's a researcher up in at Northeastern University. He has done a lot of research on how communities, rely on how people in communities rely on one another to come back from disaster. You're going to look to your family, your neighbors, your friends to help you come back more so than you are. FEMA just provides, one thing or two things, but it's your local religious groups, your churches, your mosques, your the local Red Cross. They're going to provide you, those much more tangible things to help you get back up on your feet. And so I think encouraging those relationships and encouraging people to make preparedness part of their own, like make it their own. I think is how you kind of do that. Having a go bag, having a family emergency plan, that kind of stuff. Being able to have enough supplies for 3 days. Because the federal government shows up when the federal government shows up, and hopefully, we get there quickly, but sometimes we're prevented. And a good example of that is Katrina, where, we had situations where, FEMA was in one sense prevented from being able to provide assistance. Some would say FEMA didn't want to provide assistance. I don't want to get into that, but there is a bit of personal responsibility, in taking care of you and your family. So thank you.
Good, thank you. Another question. There are
Can I chime in on that real quick?
absolutely,
All right.
please.
So I think one thing we need to remind ourselves is that all disasters start in local. And so, as the local emergency manager, I think one thing to a way of building culture of preparedness is, as we're doing our planning efforts and our mitigation efforts, we have to incorporate the whole community in that piece. So, we can go out and do education, but also incorporating our whole and engaging our community at all levels in all the phases of emergency management to ensure that they understand that, and to help build the trust, because building culture is really based on trust. And so making sure that we are connecting with our community, and like as an emergency manager, I can't know everything. I have to know a little bit about everything to be able to be an effective emergency manager. But my worldview is completely different than anybody else's in the city of Grand Rapids. So making sure that we are listening to everybody's worldview and understanding how they perceive, how they're impacted and what they can and cannot do to be prepared, and what they mean by what they feel preparedness means to them. And I think that's kind of making sure that we are connecting and building trust so that we can get them to understand what we need them to do as individuals or families or community organizations or whatever it may be to help strengthen that culture of preparedness. And it really all starts and ends with trust. And I think that's a huge, huge piece that we have to remind ourselves on as government entities. We don't know everything. We're not the leading expert in our communities, because our community is the leading expert. And we have to really make sure that we're engaging and listening to build that trust. So I just want to add that piece to that, the local level.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Another question. There are efforts underway to update how public utilities plan for resiliency. Is it appropriate for us to discuss the changes needed for public utilities, gas, electric, water, wastewater, to engage with municipalities and counties to plan for resiliency?
I can take that one.
Please.
I would say yes, 100%. I think, if you just recently saw the impacts of a small water facility down in Florida a couple weeks ago of a potential cyber issue with that, I think it's very important that, public utilities is a critical infrastructure that helps keep our communities going. And so making sure that our utilities have plans, but also the utilities are involved in the development and use of an emergency operations plan for communities. Again, making sure that they are brought to the table for hazard mitigation planning, and that we understand fully how hazards can impact those utilities so that we have proper strategies in that plan to get funding to augment and mitigate any impacts of those facilities. So I think definitely it is most definitely appropriate to discuss and have those discussions at a local level, even a regional level, depending on how your utilities are, and the changes that are necessary for that. And I think there's also the training to your personnel. It's not just things and purchasing equipment, but it's also training personnel on how we can strengthen and have those utilities more resilient.
All right. Any other thoughts on that one, or are we good? All right. Another question that's come in. In the early 1990s, we were moving homes back from the bluffs of Lake Michigan and not allowing new construction past the second dune ridge. By 2020, we were back to building on the first dune as the houses were again falling into the lake. What did we do wrong, and how do we prevent this in the future? Any thoughts on that one?
I have a few thoughts, and I want to be real careful with this statement, so I just want to say, yes, the lake is rising. I think everybody knows that, and has been. I mean, last summer was kind of a monstrous amount of lake level for Lake Michigan. But the ultimate decision on where to build in relationship to the lake, that ultimately does not fall at FEMA. That is more of a state and local decision. So.
All right. This one looks like would be for Eva. It says, Eva mentioned two things I'd like to hear everyone explore more. Actually, maybe for everyone then. Transformation of urban spaces, reclaiming walkable streets, access to public parks, and movement to rural regions. Are these positive? And if so, would FEMA subsidize or even pay for those infrastructures as resiliency or mitigation strategies?
I can take an initial stab at that.
Sure, please.
One thing, especially as we're seeing impacts of climate change and kind of how flooding is happening outside of our typical flood zones and really impacting the community in areas we never thought. I think this is, again, it's very important for that hazard mitigation plan to have strategies to then look at these areas that have repetitive flooding, to then utilize funding to either subsidize or pay for to transition those areas into maybe parks or green spaces that are easier to recover after a massive flood. We see that a lot in a lot of areas where communities will put parks in areas that are prone to flooding just because it's easier to recover and to rebuild a park than it is a house or multiple houses. So I think, just, again, it goes into that, looking at our history, our current day, and then looking at the future and how we may see things change, and really identifying those strategies in our hazard mitigation plan so we can use BRIC funding potentially bring in funding resources to help mitigate those issues down the line. And then also, I think it moves into transforming places into more green space and walkability and things like that to give more space to our communities.
Right. Any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, before Tim takes the rest, but in terms of positive whether, well, the move to rural regions, whether that's positive. So it's a twofold answer, right? On the one hand, we would like to see much more density as urban planners, because that's really important for several reasons, including economies of scale, natural resources use. We're already infringing and moving way beyond our borders into natural areas, which is also one of the reasons why COVID-19 started to spread anyways, because we're so much infringing on natural life. So we don't want to see too much movement towards rural regions unless it's really and highly dense.
All right. Well, thank you. Tim, comments,
yeah,
please?
I'll just add one quick thing.
Sure.
You know, with BRIC, some of those specific questions, like, would this qualify, would this not qualify? You know, I would definitely encourage you to take a look at the BRIC website, you know, because kind of, I mean, the sky's kind of the limit, but you have to kind of have some, I mean, there is a very large desire to prevent and mitigate future disaster in that. And so I don't want to say yes or no, whether or not something would be approved or not approved or acceptable under BRIC. But you know, please reach out to us.
Very good. Another question, can anyone speak to the state of our infrastructure, both at a local and state level? I have seen the struggle to fund and prioritize this at a local level. So if actions such as maintenance are a struggle financially and planning wise, how do we move to a model of prevention, effective planning, and resilience?
I think, again, multiple plans we've talked about and proper coordination with stakeholders and leaders and department heads in our governments is, you know, this is something to look at. Like, for example, here in the city of Grand Rapids, we are currently working on finalizing our emergency operations plan here in the next couple months. We're working on the update to the hazard mitigation plan over the next year. And then also the city is working on the update to their master plan. So actually there's a lot of cool things happening all at the same time. But I think really kind of working together on all those areas to identify these needs and properly and putting them in proper plans so that they remind folks of what's important. Because like a master plan lasts for at least 10 to 20 years. And then a hazard mitigation plan is a 5-year plan. So making sure that there's continuous coordination and identification of potential needs or current needs, and so that they're in proper areas so that we can qualify for funding, whichever funding stream there is available.
Any other thoughts on that one? All right. I see a couple of questions being edited, so let me just make sure I got the correct one here. Here we go. Is anyone in Michigan already engaged in economic output modeling to show the economy boosting and job supporting capabilities of smart expenditures to boost resiliency? Any thoughts on that one?
Well, I feel like the answer is here. Part of it. I mean, you know, extension is, you know, I feel like Harmony. I feel like you should kind of field this question.
Well, yeah, I will briefly mention that is exactly the topic of session 2 next Wednesday morning. So save the date, folks.
All right, very good. Next one probably would be Allison. How did Grand Rapids conduct a cost benefit analysis of the flood wall that worked in 2018?
It's a great question. I wasn't here for that, so I can't fully answer to that. I do know that they did take the lessons learned from the 2013 flood and how impactful that flood was to then bring in to identify funding to build that flood wall.
All right, very good. Thank you. Another question. I note the FEMA website addresses economic recovery. Is anyone in Michigan already engaged in economic output modeling to show the economy boosting and job supporting capacities of smart expenditures to boost resiliency?
I think that's a great suggestion. I don't necessarily know if, I know that we're not necessarily directly doing that. We're doing, I mean, obviously right now, everyone's so focused on COVID recovery and economic recovery in that realm. But I think what this question brings up is something that all communities should be doing, especially attaching it to a recovery framework that they can pull out and utilize when building recovery plans after a disaster. So I think it's something that should be done and incorporated into a THIRA, so a threat and hazard risk assessment that should be done, just so that we're not just looking at, we're really looking at that economic impact and fiscal impact on our community. So I think it's a need. I don't necessarily know of any community that's actually fully doing that at a holistic level.
I do want to give a shout out to the Regional Economic Innovation Center at Michigan State, Dr. Lamore's group. I think they're doing a lot of, that kind of modeling and looking at some of those impacts, economic impacts, that is.
All right. Harmony, would you say we have time for one more? We're getting close to our 10 o'clock deadline.
Yeah, one more. And just to add briefly to what Tim just said about Dr. Rex Lamore's office, Dr. Rex Lamore is one of the speakers next Wednesday morning. So we're well prepped for that topic. We're excited.
All right, we have time for one more. Could FEMA clarify that an enhanced plan involves more than just traditional planning elements? It includes things like past use of grant funds, administrative aspects. It seems to require more than just a high quality planning process. Is there any thoughts on that one?
Yes. I mean, an enhanced plan state does involve a lot more work that has to be done at the state level, and somewhat at the local level. I don't know. Is there like a specific element to that the attendees kind of interested in, or I mean, it just, yes, it does involve a bit more work.
Sure.
At the state and local level, but and it also, I think, yeah, no, go ahead.
No, that was the entire question that was presented.
Okay.
So with that, I think we're getting close right to the very end. So I guess I would just ask our panelists, are there any final thoughts you would just like to share as we wrap up?
Thank you so much. Go ahead. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Allison.
Yeah, Allison,
thank you.
Please.
I just want to thank everybody for taking time this morning to come and listen to us talk about it. I've been an emergency manager for 8 years, and I will tell you, I've been through a lot of incidents, a lot of civil unrest, unfortunately, in my career and other things. And I really encourage folks to coordination, communication, and collaboration. The 3 C's are so important in this line of work that it's not, like I said earlier, as an emergency manager, I can't know I have to know a little bit about everything to be able to be an effective emergency manager. So it's definitely the world of being resilient and emergency management is all hands on deck approach. And so we all have a role. And I truly encourage everybody to find a way of working closely with your planners, your emergency managers, your community, just to help build that culture and that trust to ensure that we're more resilient. So, and everyone have this wonderful St. Patrick's Day.
Eva, yeah, any other final thoughts?
Oh, thank you. And I hope I speak for the other two as well. But if there's any remaining questions, feel free to reach out to us. So we're happy to respond by email too.
All right, Tim?
Yeah, I just echo all that. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with y'all, and yeah, please feel free to reach out. And I'll be on the. Well, I imagine many of us. All of us maybe still be on the next panel, so I'll be there too.
Mhm.
Thank you. I look forward to learning lots.
All right. Well, I would like to personally thank all of our panelists for your presentations and your willingness to be here and share your expertise with all of us. I know I, for one, learned many things I did not know, and I'm hopeful that many of our participants did as well. And then also invite everyone to the session next Wednesday, March 24th, on defining and building resilient regional economies. So with that, we hope to see you again next week. And thank you very much for your attendance and participation today. All right.